One of the things I was curious about heading into Trails of Cold Steel was how well the series would handle the transition to 3D. Some games handled the switch with aplomb, revolutionizing the industry and broadening the landscape by which games could be presented. Some games did not. Of course, these titles were released in the late 90s when full 3D games were still learning to walk. Trails of Cold Steel released in 2013, gifting it a decade and a half of growing pains from which to learn and build on. A 15-year cornucopia of examples illustrating what works and what does not. So, with the broad shoulders of multiple gaming generations to stand upon, how did Cold Steel handle the jump to 3D? Pretty well. No idea if they were made by the same team, but the developers' previous games, The Legend of Nyuta and Ys Memories of Celceta, being in 3D, may have afforded them some practice and opportunities to iron out a few of the kinks. And while there are certainly still some sticky bits in Cold Steel's 3D presentation, overall it's functional and has an attractive, clean look that conveys story beats and character actions clearly, if not always in the most dynamic or exciting way. While I feel animation is the largest problem, let's tackle a few of the less important issues first. Movement. Cold Steel, being a full 3D game with a fully rotatable 3D camera, might make the player think they can move in any direction they point the controller's analog stick. And that's true. Kind of. The thing is, the game's protagonist can't run when moving diagonally to the camera. They can run away from or toward the camera, and they can run perpendicular to it, but if they try moving at an angle, they will slow to a walk. Not game-breaking, or all told that big a deal, but yeah, kind of annoying. Collision. I don't know if it's the stage objects or the player characters, but someone's collision boxes are too wide. Cold Steel does a nice job decorating its various sets with a variety of interesting and aesthetically attractive things to look at, interact with, and navigate around, but it's that last bit that's a frequent problem because throughout my playthrough, I constantly got hung up on the corner of a table or other environment prop I was attempting to walk past. Interaction. In order to interact with various objects or talk to non-player characters, you have to, get this, stand next to them and press the action button. The problem, particularly with characters you want to chat up, is you have to stand uncomfortably close to trigger the interaction. Much closer than I think you should have to. Over 200 hours in this title, and I still had moments where I would try to talk to someone, not get the interaction prompt, scooch a little closer to try again, not get the prompt, a little closer, a little closer, a little closer still, and there, we're practically nose to nose now, and I'm not feeling good about that. I want to talk to everyone, but I don't want to invade their personal space to do it. It makes me uncomfortable. NPCs. I praised the Crossbell games for cleverly handling the necessity of using a few character sprites for multiple characters by ensuring those NPCs were always in the same area or with the same people so they remained recognizable even though they had a few twins scattered across the city. With Cold Steel, I was hopeful the switch to 3D might help mitigate this limitation. And it does! To an extent. For the most part, every character in every town has a distinct look. Dolly has a unique appearance, and you won't find her character model anywhere else in Trista. This affords her the opportunity to move anywhere in town and stand in whatever groupings make sense, and that is a significant step up over the previous games. That said, while Dolly is one of a kind in Trista, she does have a twin in nearly every other town. Same with Gordon. You'll see his character model in other locations too, which was initially confusing because we know he travels for work, so I thought I'd just run into that character during one of our field trips, but No. Different guy. Still, it's a step in the right direction. Hopefully future games will have the resources to grant each character a bespoke visual design. And finally, animation. It's, pretty stiff. It gets the job done, but when compared to how the pre-rendered sprites of the previous games were used, its efficacy pales in comparison in terms of charm, engagement, energy, and emotion. Now, you might think, how can that be? The sprites of the previous games are barely animated, and so far as poses per action go, you're right. Let's compare a few scenes and see how they play. Here's Crow's S-Craft from Cold Steel.
Yeah, you're done. Cross Raven! See ya!
Pretty cool, right? Yeah, the animation is a bit stilted, but the concept is fun, the direction is clever, the camera movement dynamic, the visual effects are attractive, and it communicates Crow's character. Now here's Dudley's S-Craft from the Crossbell games. I would say it shares the same positive points as Crow's, just with less frames of actual animation. In fact, Dudley doesn't have much more than a dozen different poses throughout the entire sequence. And yet, I find the limited animation of Dudley's S-Craft a lot more appealing. I'll provide my thoughts on why shortly, but let's look at a couple more examples. At the end of a combat encounter in Cold Steel, a character might strike a victory pose or converse with one of their companions.
Nicely done, Elisa.
Same to you, that was great.
Solid idea, but the execution is a bit flat. It's lacking energy. Now compare that to a victory pose from an earlier game. While it's less frames of animation, I find it much more effective at putting a fist-pumping bow on a successful battle. Here's a scene early in Cold Steel where Class 7 teams up to take down a dungeon boss.
An opening! Go!
This one's mine!
Pretty slick. Yeah, the animation is simple and, again, a bit stiff, but the rest of the execution is doing a decent job compensating. Now compare that to, say, Shirley opening a giant can of whoop-ass on the CGF in Azure. Less animation. In fact, there are very few poses. The bulk of the animation is just moving the sprite around the screen, and still, I argue that this is a much more effective action scene. Here's the concert towards the end of Cold Steel. It's fine. It's nice. It's pleasant. But to me, despite having more animation, it doesn't hold a candle to the Genis Academy play in Sky, or the Arc-en-Ciel performance in Crossbell. So why are these goofy-looking, barely animated little pre-rendered sprites of the older titles so much more visually compelling than the fully 3D characters of Cold Steel? I argue that while the sprites of the previous games are lacking in detail and animation, the non-realistic presentation of the characters forces players to fill in those gaps themselves. As presented, the cast of those games are caricatures. There's an implicit understanding that Lloyd Banning's head is not literally a third the size of his entire body, so when the game presents his run animation with unique poses you can count on one hand, our brains are more than happy to fill in the missing detail, and we instead perceive a natural gait that blends seamlessly with the rest of the presentation. Whereas with the more realistic proportions of the characters in Cold Steel, there's almost nothing left to the imagination, and our brains are more inclined to set themselves to what you see is what you get mode. So Reen's stiff and awkward run, despite boasting far more individual frames of animation, just comes off as stiff and awkward. Now, having said all that, while the animation is, in my estimation, the weak link in Cold Steel's presentation, the game does a nice job of making up for it in other ways. While the animation may not be anything to write home about, the actions performed by the game's cast are often imaginative and cool, help inform the various characters' distinct personalities, and, particularly in the special attack animations, supplemented with stylish and attractive visual effects. But for my money, the MVP of this game's presentation is the camera direction, particularly in the various dialogue scenes. In the previous games, with the rare exception of a special sprite animation, dialogue scenes are presented with no character animation. They just stand there, stock still, staring at each other. All the player has to go off of is the dialogue and the character portraits that cycle through a variety of facial expressions. But this is enough to prompt our little brains to fill in all those missing details and mentally create a memorable and engaging scene. In Cold Steel, dialogue scenes play out similarly, with the 3D character models occasionally hitting a canned pose, but otherwise standing there looping through their idle animation. They too cycle through a variety of facial expressions, but as previously stated, there's less missing information for our brains to fill in, so it comes off as a very stiffly performed scene, and it would probably be pretty boring if not for the camera direction working overtime to instill these moments with some much needed energy and visual interest. Shot, reverse shot, master, over the shoulder, pans, zooms, low and high angle shots, even motivated 180-degree line crossing. The camera direction is pulling out all the stops and doing everything it can to make these scenes pop. And does all that carefully considered and well-implemented camera work transcend the dodgy animation and elevate these scenes to the upper echelons of sublime cinematic opulence? No! But it is picking up a healthy amount of slack left behind by the game's limited animated performances, resulting in a 2013 PlayStation Vita game that may have been a bit behind the 3D presentation curve when compared to its contemporaries, but certainly didn't embarrass itself. And while the animation definitely has room to improve, the mainline Trails series is otherwise off to a solid start. And while I'm not psychic, I have been granted a glimpse of the future, courtesy of the trailers for the upcoming remake of Trails in the Sky, and if that marketing is anything to go by, it looks like the animation improves quite a lot over the next half dozen or so games. And while I like using my imagination to fill in the gaps left by the simple presentation of the early game's pre-rendered sprites, it's always fun to see how someone else interprets the various scenes. For instance, one of Sky's earliest interactions depicts a young Estelle churlishly arguing with her bedridden new stepbrother by jumping up and down on his chest as he lay prone. Now, funny as that moment is as depicted, to me, such shenanigans, like the unrealistic proportions of the characters themselves, are meant to be representations, caricatures of what actually transpired. So I always saw it as Estelle crawling onto the bed and just bouncing the hell out of him, not literally using his rib cage as a trampoline. Of course, others' imaginations may play that scene in any number of different ways. I think the series going forward is gonna be just fine.